If you are looking for a fun and effective way to help fill your deer tag this year, you may consider using a decoy. We just released our top 5 decoy hunts and thought it'd be the perfect time to follow that video up with a tips and tricks video, talk a little bit about what we've done in the past that has worked, what we've done that hasn't worked, and what we've learned over the past 10 to 15 years using a decoy. So if you haven't tried it, I would highly encourage you to try it, and I will add that primarily our experience has been mainly with using a buck decoy. Obviously there's doe decoys, and we've used doe decoys in conjunction with buck decoys a little bit, and doe decoys can be really effective, but I tend to lean towards using a buck decoy 90% of the time. Not only is it extremely exciting, obviously having a mature buck come into bow range, into a decoy mad, stomping his feet all puffed up is one of the most exciting things and can be such a huge adrenaline rush, but it also can be extremely effective and a lot of times can draw in a buck that you wouldn't otherwise have any chance of getting into bow range. So right now it is, the third week of October, which is the perfect time to start using a decoy. And I've used a decoy as early as middle of October. Really kind of just depends on what you're seeing and how the deer are acting. If you have, bucks on camera sparring, fighting, they're kind of starting to establish their territories right now. They know the rut's coming. And so they're really starting, their testosterone levels are rising and they're starting to tolerate each other less and less every day. And so there has been instances when I've used the decoy, middle of October, which seems kind of early, but it's always been a situation where I'm hunting a particular buck that is super aggressive. I've noticed him posturing up to other bucks in the field. I've noticed him, pushing deer around and doing things that mark him as a territorial buck. And so starting mid of October, you can use a decoy all the way up, through the rut and into the post rut, anytime that the deer are going to be competing, for does or, fighting, pushing each other around. And so it can be effective, anytime. It really just depends on, the farm you're hunting. And like the rut, obviously the rut is, you hear people all the time, oh yeah, the rut's going crazy right now. And you might be 10 miles down the road and not seeing anything. So it's very situational. And it always really depends on the farm and the area. So the best thing you can do is just use your knowledge of what you've been seeing on camera, what you've been seeing in person, and go from there. But that gives you a pretty big window. October, 15th to say, the end of November. You're looking at 6 weeks where you can utilize this tactic. So when it comes to picking out a decoy, like I said, I primarily we're using a buck decoy. I like the Dave Smith buck decoy. I've been using that decoy for the past 7 or 8 years probably, and it is the most realistic decoy on the market aside from a stuffed mounted taxidermy decoy. So obviously if you're trying to fool a mature buck, the more realistic the better, but there are tons of options out there. And if you catch a buck in the right mood, I mean, I've seen guys in the past use like those Delta 3D targets and have a buck come into it, or if you have them in the yard and you wake up one day and the antlers and the head are knocked off the target, like if they're in the right mood, it doesn't matter, but I never leave it up to chance. So the more realistic, the better. When it comes to doe decoys, Dave Smith actually makes a bedded doe decoy as well that I've used a little bit, and I have not used, they have a standing doe and a bedded doe. I've not used a doe decoy on its own, although there's been instances when I've been hunting where I've thought, man, I would love to have a doe decoy just to pique the interest of a buck, get him to come across the field and check this doe, see if she's in heat. This time of year when the bucks are cruising looking for that first doe, a lot of times, they'll come check a doe. So there's definitely instances where I could see that being effective. But like I said, I just know what I know and what I've experienced, and I have so much confidence in the buck decoy. That's typically, where I lean. Where I love having the bedded doe decoy is in conjunction with the buck decoy. So you set the buck decoy up, have him looking at that bedded doe, put her 10 yards away, 5 yards away, whatever it may be, and it just kind of emulates that buck locked down with the doe, which can really, really trigger a buck's attitude. So the more realistic, the better. When it comes to the setup of the decoy, that's something that we get tons of questions about and that I've kind of toyed with over the years. And distance-wise, I like to keep the decoy at about 30 yards, 25 to 30, depending on the situation, obviously. But a lot of people make the mistake, and I've made the mistake, of putting the decoy too close to you. And when you do that, you don't leave a buffer zone between the decoy and you to where a deer might be comfortable enough, circling in downwind. They may want to get way downwind, and if that happens, they're going to get behind you and downwind. And so if you leave it at 30, gives you a little more buffer zone, and they typically will circle, 10 yards downwind, come in right about 20. I like to, if at all possible, utilize hard edges. So, we're in tree stands most of the time, or set up on the edge of tree rows, whatever it may be. So a tree row is a pretty good hard edge. Typically they're not going to leave the field and go into the timber if they have space to get in between the decoy and the timber. They can just walk right down the edge and come into that decoy. If you have a fence line or a really steep creek, like the hard edges, those are ideal because the deer just aren't going to get downwind of you. So I try to utilize that when I am decoying and try to set up on spots where I know deer can't get downwind, because that absolutely is going to be the first thing that they do every time. When it comes to placement of the decoy, I like to place the decoy quartered to me and facing usually towards the trees or the structure that I'm set up on. Try to emulate a buck looking into the timber at a doe that's maybe bedded in the timber or in the timber, like just walking in the timber or whatever. I like to face him towards that direction, and I like to typically face the buck decoy if I can away from where I expect the buck to come from. So that way it's kind of like turkeys when they see the back of that tail fan of the turkey and they're coming out, and they see that turkey's not coming out of strut. It's not respecting his presence in the field. Same thing goes with the buck decoy. The Dave Smith is a postured up decoy, and so it looks like he's mad and ready to fight, and so he's not backing down from anything. So that will really help trigger that emotion with a different buck. So I face it away from where they're coming if I can, quartered to me, because the deer are going to circle downwind, especially the mature bucks are going to come approaching head on. So if your decoy's quartered to you, the buck circles in downwind and approaches head on, he should ideally be quartered away from you. So that's my go-to setup when I'm setting up a decoy. One thing to keep in mind with the decoy is you get a buck locked in, he's not going to stop. I mean, they are mad, they're angry, and they just tune out everything else. And so I've had situations where you try to stop them, and they just blow the decoy up. And if you're lucky, they'll hang around, they'll wonder what happened, and you'll be able to get a shot off still. But I would not bank on that. So what I always tell people is be ready to shoot a deer on the walk. And I hate shooting any deer on the walk. But fortunately, like when they're coming into the decoys, they're typically walking pretty slow, stiff-legging. And so you can kind of get on the deer. You draw back, give yourself some time to get a shot off, and then just kind of follow him. And you can try stopping them. But if you do, I would try stopping them a good ways before the decoy, because once they approach those final 5 yards, a lot of times they're gearing, rearing up for plowing that thing over. Decoy hunting is exciting. I would highly encourage you to try it. I would use a decoy in areas where you are not going to expect a lot of deer. So a lot of times we'll set up literally in what we call like an observation stand, a stand where you would probably have 5% chance of killing a buck out of this stand otherwise. So you're off the main corridors to where you're not going to have encounters with does, because that's like one of the biggest issues people run into is does don't tolerate a buck just standing there not moving. They get uneasy about it, they come in downwind, they blow, and they can ruin your hunt. And so using these observation type areas where you're kind of off the main path, where you're looking into that area, to where you can see bucks cruising, call to them, get their attention, and they can see the decoy and then come in. That's the ideal situation. That's pretty rare where I will use like a decoy in a food plot, where it's a high density concentration of deer. Just because of that, you're going to have deer spook. And so obviously there's been situations where I've tried that, I've done that, and it's worked out, but it tends to be, you have more failure than success when you're hunting those areas where you're going to have a lot of deer that are just not going to deal with the decoy. So definitely try decoy hunting if you haven't tried it yet. Don't give up if you have one bad experience. It takes the right buck in the right mood, and it can be just absolutely magical. So especially if you're in an area where the deer buck to doe ratio is more in balance, there's a lot of competition, they're just really, really more susceptible to the decoy. If you're in an area where there's just tons of does, there's not a lot of buck competition, obviously they're not going to be too concerned about another buck in their area. So, but definitely try it out this fall if you haven't. If you guys have had luck, other tips and stuff that we haven't mentioned, feel free to please drop them in the comments. Let's hear some of your success stories as well. But grab a decoy, get out there, and it might just be the difference maker that you need to fill your tag this fall.